The wind clawed at my face as I trudged up the icy hill. The envelope crumpled in my pocket like a guilty secret. The letter had arrived that morning, its pristine parchment contrasting with the mundane clutter on my desk. No name adorned the envelope, no sender's address, just my own name scrawled in a sharp, angular script. I almost threw it away, but something in the wax seal, a symbol etched with an intricacy that seemed to shimmer, fleetingly, like frost on glass, stayed my hand. Inside, the message was brief, cryptic. At the stroke of midnight, time will reveal its truth. Below, an address I recognized, Lickenclaw Manor, a place spoken of in hushed tones in the village. Tales of its towering clock and its inexplicable pull on those who dared approach were common fodder in the local pub. The storm threatened to turn me back as I reached the estate, but the sight of the manor held me captive. It loomed over the landscape, a shadow against the indigo night, its spires piercing the sky like frozen daggers. Snow blanketed the stone walls, but the windows glowed warmly, laughter and music spilling faintly into the cold. I hesitated on the threshold, hand poised to knock on the heavy wooden door, when it creaked open unbidden. "Welcome," a voice greeted me, smooth as ice. A butler stood before me, his face pale and gaunt, yet his eyes gleamed with something unspoken. He gestured for me to enter, and I stepped into a hall that was almost aggressively grand. Chandeliers cast flickering golden light over marble floors, but the air was cold, as if the walls themselves exhaled frost. The other guests were dressed in fine evening wear, holding delicate glasses of champagne and talking in lilting voices that felt slightly off. Their words were too practiced, their laughter too hollow. A grand staircase twisted up to the shadows above, but my gaze was drawn to the centerpiece of the room, the clock. It stood over 12 feet tall, carved from dark mahogany, so rich it seemed to drink in the light. Vines of silver and gold wove intricate patterns across its surface, their delicate etchings interrupted by grotesque faces, each frozen in an expression of terror. The pendulum hung motionless, its brass gleaming like an unsheathed blade. Despite its stillness, I felt as though it pulsed faintly, a heartbeat waiting to resume. The butler appeared at my side. "Magnificent, isn't it?" His voice carried a note of reverence, tinged with something darker. "You are fortunate. Few are chosen to see its truth." "What truth?" I asked, my breath clouding in the frigid air. He didn't answer. Instead, he placed a flute of champagne in my hand and melted back into the shadows. I wanted to leave, but my feet refused to move. Something about the clock compelled me to stay, to watch, to listen. As the night stretched on, I found myself drifting toward it, ignoring the shallow pleasantries of the guests. They seemed to blur together, their features indistinct under the clock's looming presence. I touched its cold surface, and the room's warmth vanished entirely. The clock whispered. I recoiled, my hand trembling as I pulled away from the clock's frozen wood. The laughter and chatter of the guests faltered, dimming as if the air itself had thickened. The chandelier's light flickered, casting fleeting shadows that writhed like living things. A woman in a deep crimson gown noticed my unease. She approached, her gloved hand brushing my arm. "It's intoxicating, isn't it?" she murmured, her voice low and sultry. "What is?" "The allure of the frostbound clock," she replied. Her eyes, too bright, too wide, held mine for a moment before she smiled, her teeth unnaturally sharp. "It knows you now. It sees you." Before I could respond, she vanished into the crowd, leaving me cold and exposed. My heart hammered in my chest, the sound loud against the sudden silence. And then, faintly at first, I heard it. Tick. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it resonated deep within me. I looked to the clock, its pendulum still motionless, yet the sound persisted. Tick, tick, tick. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Some glanced at the clock with expressions that hovered between awe and terror. Others stilled completely, their gazes unfocused, as though listening to something only they could hear. The frost began to spread. It started at the base of the clock, a delicate filigree of ice that crawled along the floor in tendrils. I stepped back instinctively, the frost biting at my shoes. The air grew colder, and my breath came in visible puffs. One by one, the guests' laughter faltered, replaced by uneasy murmurs. "Is this part of the festivities?" someone asked, their voice trembling. The butler reappeared, his face expressionless. "It is the clock's will," he said simply. "What does that mean?" I demanded, my voice rising. Before he could answer, the clock chimed. The sound was deafening, a single resonant note that seemed to echo through my very bones. The frost surged forward, climbing the walls, threading through the chandelier, and extinguishing every flame in the room. Darkness engulfed us, save for the faint, otherworldly glow emanating from the clock's face. It struck 12. Time stopped. The guests froze mid-movement, their faces twisted into masks of shock and fear. Snow swirled within the room, glittering faintly in the clock's eerie light. I stood alone, the only one who could move, as the frostbound clock's pendulum began to sway. Its ticking filled the silence, each beat heavier, colder, louder. Tick, tick, tick. The room whispered, voices slithering from the frost-covered walls. "You have been chosen." The clock's pendulum swung with dreadful precision, its motion drawing my gaze like a moth to a flame. The whispers in the room grew louder, words overlapping in a cacophony of voices that felt both ancient and immediate. My breath hitched as I turned, hoping to find some sign of life among the guests. But they were statues, encased in frost. Their faces, once animated with hollow laughter, were now locked in expressions of terror. One man's glass teetered in midair, the champagne within frozen mid-splash. A woman in an emerald gown stood with her mouth open, as if she had been screaming. Frost crawled over their bodies, encasing them inch by inch, the glimmer of ice catching the pale bluish light that now radiated from the clock. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking against the silence. It felt wrong to speak, as though my words violated a sacred stillness. The room responded with a soft groan, the walls quivering as if alive. Shadows gathered at the edges of the space, pooling like ink and spilling forth in languid waves. My body screamed at me to move, to run, to escape the manor and its cursed clock. But I couldn't. My feet remained rooted to the floor, the frost licking at my shoes as if testing me. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, a deep and resonant tone that seemed to emanate from the clock itself. "Tick, tock, mortal, you linger where you do not belong." I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the slick frost beneath me. What is this?" I managed, my words barely audible over the rhythmic ticking that now consumed the room. The voice ignored my question. "The hands turn only for the chosen. The others are offerings, their moments devoured." My gaze darted to the frozen figures around me. "Offerings? No, they're people. You can't just—" "Their time has ceased to be," the voice interrupted, emotionless and final. "As shall yours, unless you embrace the truth." The frost surged up my legs, a sharp, searing cold that burned like fire. I screamed, clawing at the ice, but it would not relent. Panic surged as I realized it wasn't trying to encase me like the others. It was pulling me toward the clock. I flailed, my hands grasping at the ground, the air, anything to anchor myself. My fingers brushed against something, a brass key lying cold and out of place on the frost-covered floor. Instinctively, I grabbed it. The moment I touched the key, the frost recoiled and the whispers faltered. The pendulum hesitated mid-swing, its relentless rhythm breaking for the first time. The silence was deafening. I staggered to my feet, clutching the key like a lifeline. The clock loomed before me, its surface now shimmering with an ethereal light. The faces carved into its wood twisted and shifted, their expressions warping into grotesque grimaces of pain and malice. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the cavernous stillness. The clock's hands began to move, their motion slow but deliberate. Midnight rewound itself, the chimes reversing in a discordant melody that clawed at my ears. The voice returned, louder and more insistent. "Turn the key, unlock the heart, only then shall the cycle be broken." The frost surged again, coiling around the room like a serpent, closing in on me and the frozen guests. The clock's glow intensified, casting the room in an eerie, pulsating light. I knew I had no choice. Whatever lay within the heart of the clock, it was my only chance to end this nightmare. I approached the clock with halting steps, the key cold and heavy in my trembling hand. The carved faces on its surface seemed to follow me, their twisted features contorting as if in warning or mockery. The pendulum resumed its swing, the ticking now louder, faster, as though the clock itself grew impatient. With each step, the air grew colder, the frost biting at my skin and drawing thin trails of blood where it touched. My breath clouded the air, the puffs quick and shallow as dread tightened its grip around my chest. The keyhole revealed itself at the clock's base, a small and ornate opening that gleamed faintly with an unnatural light. My hand shook as I knelt, fitting the key into the lock. "Turn it," the voice commanded, its tone now laced with urgency. I hesitated. The whispers returned, softer now, almost pleading. I glanced over my shoulder at the frozen guests, their silent figures caught mid-sentence, mid-laughter, mid-scream. Was there truly any saving them? "Turn the key or join them," the voice growled. Swallowing my fear, I turned the key. A deafening roar filled the room as the clock's door swung open, revealing a cavity filled with intricate, otherworldly mechanisms. Gears turned with impossible precision, their surfaces etched with runes that pulsed like veins. At the heart of it all was a glowing orb of frost and light, swirling with shadows that writhed and fought against their confines. The whispers crescendoed, now overlapping cries of anger, sorrow, and desperation. My vision blurred as the cold seeped deeper into my bones, threatening to claim me as its next victim. The orb pulsed violently, and the frost lunged toward me, coiling around my throat. I clawed at it desperately, the clock's light growing brighter and brighter until it filled my vision. "End it," the voice hissed. "Break the heart." I grabbed the orb, its surface burning and freezing my hands simultaneously. With a guttural scream, I wrenched it from its place, the runes shattering into shards of light. The clock let out a final, terrible chime, its sound reverberating through the room as the frost retreated in a whirlwind of snow and shadow. The frozen guests collapsed to the floor, gasping and coughing as life returned to them. The clock crumbled before me, its wood splintering and its gears grinding to a halt. I stared at the ruined remains, the key still clutched in my hand. The whispers were gone. But as I turned to leave, a faint tick echoed through the silence, a reminder that the Frostbound Clock's curse was not so easily vanquished. The room was silent now, save for the faint, intermittent ticking that seemed to bleed from the ruined clock. The partygoers lay scattered across the frost-rimed floor, their groans of pain and confusion breaking the stillness. I staggered to my feet, my breath misting the frigid air, and glanced around, heart pounding. The destruction should have brought relief, But it hadn't. The shattered remains of the clock still exuded a strange presence. Its gears, though dislodged and scattered, gleamed with a faint, ghostly light. The frost clinging to the walls no longer spread, but it hadn't melted either. It hung there like a spectral reminder, whispering of a power that refused to be extinguished. I turned to the others. "It's over," I said, though the words felt hollow. No one responded. Their faces, pale and slack, held a haunted vacancy that chilled me more than the frost. The butler stirred first, his gaunt frame moving with unnatural stiffness. His eyes, once sharp with unspoken secrets, were now dull and sunken, but they fixed on me with an eerie clarity. "You think you've won," he rasped, his voice grating like metal against stone. "But time cannot be destroyed. It only waits." "What are you talking about?" I snapped, exhaustion and dread sharpening my tone. The butler rose unsteadily, his movements jerky, almost mechanical. "You took the heart, but you left the soul," he said. "And now, it is bound to you." My fingers tightened around the brass key still clutched in my hand, its cold biting into my palm. "Bound to me? Number, I stopped it. I ended this." He gave a dry, humorless laugh, his form shimmering like heat waves on a cold day. "You delayed it. That is all. The frostbound clock does not die. It sleeps. And when it wakes..." His words trailed off as his body disintegrated into snow, the wind carrying him away in a silent gust. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as my eyes fell on the others. The frost on their skin had melted, but something in their expressions had not changed. They stared at me, unblinking, their faces drawn and lifeless. One by one they stood. "We have to leave," I whispered, though the words felt like they were for me alone. I moved toward the door, the key growing heavier with each step. When I reached the threshold, the shadows in the room deepened, and the faint ticking grew louder, no longer emanating from the clock's remains. It came from me, from the key. I froze, my blood running cold. The others began to move toward me, their steps slow and synchronized, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You are the clock now," one of them said, their voice a monotone chorus of layered whispers. "Time has chosen you." "No," I muttered, shaking my head as I backed away. "This isn't happening." But it was. The ticking grew faster, resonating in my chest, in my skull. Each beat felt like it was carving itself into my bones, marking me, claiming me. The room seemed to shrink, the frost creeping closer, the whispers growing into a deafening roar. "Let me go!" I screamed, raising the key as if to throw it. The moment it left my hand, the ticking stopped. The key hit the ground with a sharp clang, spinning wildly before coming to rest. For an instant, the frost halted, the whispers silenced. The room was deathly still. And then, the clock's shattered remains shifted. The gears and fragments moved of their own accord, drawn together by an invisible force. They reassembled with terrifying speed, their jagged edges snapping into place. Within seconds, the frost-bound clock stood whole once more, its pendulum swaying with a dreadful finality. The hands began to turn, faster and faster, until they blurred into a glowing spectral circle. The room quaked, the frost surged, and a hollow, mournful chime rang out. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the clock's face, its runes blazing with light. And within its glass, my reflection stared back at me, twisted, frozen, and trapped behind the swirling hands. The frost-bound clock was whole again, and so was I, forever.